The day my children told me my grandson Connor was dying in a car accident, I signed what I thought was a hospital consent form through my tears. I had no idea they had just handed me my own will, and that their greed would become their biggest mistake. What happened next would destroy our family forever, but not in the way they planned. I'm Margaret Sullivan, and for 73 years, I believed family was everything. I raised 4 children as a single mother after my husband Arthur passed when they were young. I worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, doing bookkeeping during the day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. And taking in laundry on weekends, just to keep food on our table and send them to good schools. Every sacrifice I made was for them. Every dollar I saved, every opportunity I gave up, every dream I postponed. It was all so my children could have better lives than I did. By the time I reached my 70s, those sacrifices had paid off. The small house I'd bought with nothing down had appreciated to nearly $800,000 in our gentrified neighborhood. The life insurance policy I'd barely afforded to keep paying had grown to $500,000. The retirement accounts I'd contributed to religiously, even when it meant eating beans and rice for weeks, had swelled to over $2 million. Most importantly, I'd kept my late husband's family ranch in Montana, 300 acres of pristine land that developers were now offering millions for. My children knew about my assets, of course. Stephen, my eldest at 51, was a real estate lawyer who'd helped me organize my affairs. Emily, 49, worked in financial planning and constantly reminded me about estate taxes. Louisa, 47, had married well and often dropped hints about how the family money could be better managed. And Gabby, my youngest at 45, struggled with debt from her failed restaurant and frequently made comments about inheritances being wasted on old people. I thought their interest in my finances came from love and concern. I was a fool. The morning of October 15th started like any other. I was in my garden, tending to the roses Arthur had planted before he died, when Stephen's car pulled into my driveway. Behind him came Emily's silver sedan, then Louisa's luxury SUV, and finally Gabby's beat-up Honda. Seeing all 4 of my children arrive together sent a chill through me. This only happened during emergencies or holidays. Stephen reached me first, his face grave and his eyes red-rimmed. "Mom, you need to sit down," he said, his voice breaking. "It's about Connor." Connor was Louisa's 17-year-old son, my oldest grandson and the light of my life. He was a senior in high school, captain of the basketball team, planning to study engineering in college. Just last weekend, he'd helped me fix my kitchen faucet and talked excitedly about his upcoming graduation. "What about Connor?" I whispered, my gardening gloves suddenly feeling too heavy for my shaking hands. Emily stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "There's been an accident, Mom. A terrible accident. Connor was driving to school this morning when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit him head-on." The world tilted. I felt my knees buckle, and Stephen caught me before I could fall. "Is he?" I couldn't finish the question. "He's alive," Louisa sobbed. "But barely. He's in a coma at Seattle General. They're saying the next few hours are critical. The doctors need permission to perform emergency surgery, but there are complications with the insurance, and they need family authorization for everything." Gabby pressed a tissue into my hand. "We need to get to the hospital immediately. All of us. The doctors said family presence might help, and they need multiple signatures for the surgical procedures." My mind was reeling. My sweet Connor, so young, so full of life, fighting for his survival in some sterile hospital room. I couldn't lose him. I couldn't lose another piece of my heart. "We have the car ready," Stephen said, guiding me toward the house. "But first, the hospital sent these forms ahead. They need them signed and notarized before we arrive, or they won't be able to start the surgery. Every minute counts, Mom. I barely noticed what was happening around me. Emily was gathering my purse and jacket. Louisa was on the phone with someone, speaking in urgent whispers about medical procedures and time being critical. Gabby was crying so hard she could barely speak. All I could think about was Connor, his laugh, his smile, the way he called me Grandma Maggie, even though he was almost 18. Stephen spread several papers across my kitchen table. "The hospital needs your signature as the primary next of kin," he explained, his voice tight with urgency. "It's standard procedure for emergency surgeries involving minors. Your signature authorizes them to do whatever's necessary to save Connor's life." Through my tears, I could barely see the documents. They looked official. Lots of legal language, medical terminology, hospital letterhead at the top. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly hold the pen. "Where do I sign?" I whispered. "Here." "And here and here," Emily said, pointing to highlighted lines throughout the papers. "And we need your initials on each page. I'm so sorry to put you through this paperwork when you're in such pain, but the hospital won't operate without proper authorization." I signed everywhere they indicated. My signature was barely legible through my trembling, but I managed to complete every line they showed me. A notary public, someone Stephen said he'd called to meet us here for speed, stamped each page with an official seal. "That's everything," Stephen said, gathering the papers quickly. "Now we need to go. The surgery is scheduled to start in 2 hours, and it's a 90-minute drive to Seattle." As we rushed toward the cars, my mind was consumed with one thought. Please God, let Connor survive. I would give anything, my house, my money, my own life, if it meant saving my grandson. I had no idea I had just signed away everything I owned to the very people now driving me to what I believed was my grandson's deathbed. And I had no idea that their carefully orchestrated deception contained a fatal flaw that would ultimately destroy them all. The 90-minute drive to Seattle General Hospital was the longest of my life. I sat in the back seat of Stephen's car, clutching a photo of Connor from his last birthday, while my children took turns calling ahead to the hospital with updates that seemed increasingly vague. "Yes, this is Stephen Sullivan," my eldest would say into his phone. "I'm calling about the Connor Westfield case." "What?" "Oh, you'll need to transfer me to a different department." Then he'd hang up, looking frustrated. "Hospital bureaucracy," he'd mutter. "They keep transferring me around." Something felt off, but grief has a way of clouding judgment. When you're terrified of losing someone you love, you don't question the people trying to help you save them. The first real sign, something was wrong, came when we reached the hospital parking lot. Stephen parked in the visitors section and we all climbed out, but nobody seemed to know exactly where to go. For people who had supposedly been coordinating with medical staff all morning, my children seemed remarkably unprepared. "Which entrance do we use for the trauma unit?" I asked, looking at the massive building with multiple wings and entrances. Emily checked her phone. I'm not sure. Let me call the contact number they gave us." She dialed, waited, then frowned. "It's going straight to voicemail." "That's strange," Louisa said, but she didn't look surprised. She looked nervous. We approached the main information desk, where a tired-looking volunteer with kind eyes smiled at us. "How can I help you?" "We're here for Connor Westfield," I said, my voice breaking on his name. "He was brought in this morning, after a car accident. We're his family." The volunteer typed into her computer, then frowned. She typed again, checked another screen, then looked up at us with confusion. "I'm sorry, but I don't show any patient by that name registered today. Are you sure about the spelling?" My heart stopped. "Connor Westfield, Westfield. He's 17 years old. Car accident this morning involving a drunk driver." More typing, more checking. The woman's frown deepened. Ma'am, I'm not showing any traffic accidents involving minors today, and definitely no one by that name. Could he have been taken to a different hospital? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I turned to look at my children, expecting to see the same confusion and panic I was feeling. Instead, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. They were all looking at each other, not at the volunteer. Silent communication was passing between them. The kind of looks people share when they're caught in a lie. Maybe there's been a mistake with the paperwork, Stephen said quickly. Hospitals make errors all the time. Let me try calling our contact again. But I was no longer listening to Stephen. I was watching Gabby, who had gone completely pale and was staring at her shoes. I was watching Emily, who kept checking her phone with the nervous energy of someone expecting an important call. I was watching Louisa, who was biting her lip, something she only did when she was lying. "Where is my grandson?" I asked quietly. "Mom, there's obviously been some kind of mix-up," Emily said, her voice too bright, too forced. "Maybe he was taken to Harbor View instead. Or maybe the computer system is down. You know how technology can be." I pulled out my own phone and dialed Connor's number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hey, Grandma Maggie, what's up?" Connor. My Connor. Very much alive, very much healthy, and clearly nowhere near a hospital bed. "Connor?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Yeah, it's me. I'm at school. We just finished first period. Is everything okay? You sound weird." The world tilted again, but this time it wasn't from grief. It was from a dawning, horrible realization. I could feel my children watching me, could sense their growing panic as they realized what phone call I was making. I thought you were hurt," I managed to say. Connor laughed. "Hurt? No way, I'm perfectly fine. Actually, I aced my calculus test this morning. I wanted to call and tell you about it later. Are you sure you're okay, Grandma?" "Yes," I lied. "Yes, I'm fine. I love you, sweetheart." "Love you too. See you this weekend for our usual dinner?" "Of course," I said, though I wondered if anything would ever be usual again. I hung up and slowly turned to face my 4 children. They stood in a semicircle around me in that hospital lobby, and for the first time in my life, I saw them clearly. Not as the babies I had nursed through fevers, not as the children I had sacrificed everything to raise, not as the adults I was proud to call my family. I saw them as strangers. As people who had just put me through the most terrifying experience of my life for reasons I was only beginning to understand. "Connor is fine," I said quietly. "He's at school. He just finished taking a calculus test." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. Stephen was staring at his hands. Louisa had tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of relief. They were tears of fear. Gabby looked like she might be sick. "Mom," Stephen finally said, "we can explain." "Can you?" I asked. "Can you explain why you told me my grandson was dying? Can you explain why you made me sign papers while I was sobbing and terrified? Can you explain why we're standing in a hospital where no one has ever heard of the emergency you described?" None of them could meet my eyes. "What did I sign?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would destroy everything I thought I knew about my children. Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "We'll discuss it at home, Mom, not here." But I was done being managed, done being handled like a fragile thing that might break if exposed to the truth. "What did I sign?" I repeated, louder this time. And in that moment, standing in the lobby of a hospital where no tragedy had occurred, surrounded by the 4 people I had loved most in the world, I realized that my real emergency was just beginning. The ride home was suffocating. I sat in the back seat again, but this time the silence felt different, heavy with guilt and unspoken truths. My children kept exchanging glances in the rearview mirror, and I could practically hear their minds racing, trying to figure out how to handle what had just happened. When we reached my house, they all followed me inside without being invited. That should have been my first clue that this conversation was far from over. They positioned themselves around my living room like they were preparing for battle, not like children visiting their mother. "Mom, please sit down," Stephen said, using the same tone he probably used with difficult clients. "We need to talk." "Yes, we do," I replied, remaining standing. "Starting with what I signed this morning." Emily pulled out copies of the papers from her purse, papers I now realized she'd been carrying all along, the supposed hospital forms that had been so urgently needed. "It's complicated," she began. "Uncomplicate it," I said. Louisa stepped forward, tears still glistening in her eyes. "Mom, we were trying to protect you. You're 73 years old and you're living alone in this big house. What if something happens to you? What if you have a stroke or a heart attack or fall down the stairs?" "What does that have to do with lying about Connor dying?" Gabby finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "We needed you to sign your will, a new will, but we knew you'd never agree to it if we just asked." The words hit me like a physical blow. "My will?" Stephen took over, slipping into his lawyer voice. "Mom, your current will is outdated. It was written 15 years ago, and the tax implications alone could cost the family hundreds of thousands of dollars. We had a new one drawn up that would protect your assets, create trusts for the grandchildren, and ensure everything is properly structured for tax efficiency." "You had a new will drawn up," I repeated slowly, "without consulting me." "We consulted estate planning experts," Emily said defensively. "Tax attorneys, financial advisors, everything was done professionally. But not with me, not with the person whose will it actually is." The room fell silent again. I looked at the papers Emily was holding, and for the first time I really focused on them. What I saw made my blood run cold. "Let me see those," I said, reaching for the documents. Emily hesitated, then handed them over. As I read through the pages, each line felt like another betrayal. This wasn't just a new will, it was a complete restructuring of my entire estate. According to these documents, my house would be sold immediately upon my death, with the proceeds divided equally among my 4 children. My retirement accounts would be liquidated and distributed the same way. The Montana ranch, Arthur's family land that I had promised to keep in the family forever, would be sold to the highest bidder. But the most devastating part was a clause I almost missed, buried in legal language on page 7. "In the event of the grantor's mental incapacity or inability to manage her own affairs, as determined by 2 licensed physicians, the undersigned beneficiaries are hereby granted immediate power of attorney and executorship over all assets listed herein." I read that section 3 times before its full meaning sank in. "This isn't just a will," I said, my voice deadly quiet. "This gives you power of attorney. This means if you can get 2 doctors to say I'm mentally incompetent, you can take control of everything I own while I'm still alive." Stephen's face flushed red. "It's a standard provision for asset protection." "Asset protection?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Protection from whom? From me?" "Mom, you're not thinking clearly," Louisa said. "This is exactly why we need these provisions in place. You're getting older and your judgment—" "My judgment?" I cut her off. "My judgment told me something was wrong this morning when you all showed up with this elaborate lie. My judgment told me to call Connor when your story didn't add up. My judgment seems to be working perfectly fine." I kept reading, and each new section was worse than the last. Not only would my assets be liquidated and divided immediately upon any declaration of mental incapacity, but my children would also have the authority to place me in appropriate, long-term care facilities at their discretion. They hadn't just tried to steal my money, they had tried to steal my freedom. "You were planning to have me declared incompetent," I said, the full scope of their betrayal finally becoming clear. This whole thing, the fake emergency, the emotional manipulation, getting me to sign these papers while I was hysterical, this was all preparation for having me locked away somewhere while you divided up my life's work. It's not like that, Emily protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Then what is it like? I demanded. Explain to me how lying about your nephew's death, terrorizing me into signing legal documents I didn't understand, and planning to have me declared mentally incompetent is somehow in my best interest. Gabby was crying openly now. We weren't going to actually use those provisions unless we had to. Unless you really did become incapable of taking care of yourself. And who exactly would make that determination? I asked. You? The same children. Who just proved they're willing to orchestrate elaborate deceptions to get what they want? Stephen stood up, his patience clearly exhausted. Mom, this is ridiculous. We're your children. We love you. Everything we've done has been to protect your interests and preserve the family's financial security. I looked at him. This man I had raised, this son I had been so proud of when he graduated law school, this person who was now using his legal training to systematically strip away my autonomy, and I felt something inside me break. Not my spirit. That would take much more than this to destroy. What broke was my illusion that these 4 people were still my children in any meaningful sense of the word. They had become something else entirely. Predators who shared my DNA. Get out, I said, quietly. Mom, Emily started. Get out of my house, all of you, right now. They hesitated, looking at each other uncertainly. But the papers, Stephen began, are signed, I finished. You got what you came for. Now leave. As they filed out, murmuring amongst themselves about my emotional state and how they'd try again when I calmed down, I realized something that would have terrified me just hours earlier but now filled me with cold determination. They thought they had won. They thought they had outmaneuvered a foolish old woman who would never figure out what they had done. They had no idea how wrong they were about to be. After my children left, I sat in my empty house holding those papers, and the true magnitude of their betrayal began to reveal itself. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision born from panic or misguided concern. This had been planned, calculated, and orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. I called my longtime attorney, Harold Morrison, a man I'd trusted for over 20 years. When his secretary put me through, his voice was warm and familiar. Margaret, what a pleasant surprise. How are you doing? Harold, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have any of my children contacted you recently about my will or estate planning? There was a pause, a long pause that told me everything I needed to know. Margaret, I think we should meet in person to discuss this. No, Harold. I need to know right now. Have they contacted you? Another pause. Stephen called me about 6 months ago. He said the family was concerned about your estate planning and wanted to discuss updating your will. I told him that any changes would need to come directly from you, and that I couldn't discuss your private affairs with anyone else, even family. 6 months ago, this had been in the works for half a year. What exactly did he say? He mentioned that your current will was outdated, that there could be significant tax implications, and that the family wanted to ensure everything was properly structured. When I told him I'd need your direct authorization to discuss any changes, he seemed frustrated. Did any of the others call you? Emily called about 2 months later with similar questions. She was more persistent, asking about the specific provisions in your current will and whether there were any mechanisms for updating it if you became incapacitated. I gave her the same answer I gave Stephen. My hands were trembling as I processed this information. Harold, if I signed a new will today under emotional duress, without understanding what I was signing, would it be legally binding? That would depend on several factors. Was it properly witnessed and notarized? I thought back to that morning. The notary had appeared so quickly, almost as if they'd been waiting outside. Yes, it was notarized. Margaret, I think you need to come in tomorrow. Bring the documents you signed. We need to review everything carefully. After I hung up, I walked through my house with new eyes. How long had they been planning this? How many family dinners had I attended where they were secretly strategizing about my assets? How many times had they visited me not out of love, but to assess my mental state and plan their next move? I went to my desk and pulled out my appointment calendar. Over the past 6 months, there had been an unusual number of coincidental visits. Emily had stopped by frequently with homemade meals, always staying to chat about my health and whether I was managing okay on my own. Louisa had suggested several times that I should get a full medical checkup, offering to drive me to appointments with doctors I'd never heard of. Gabby had asked repeatedly about my daily routines, my memory, whether I was taking any medications. Stephen had been the most insidious. As my lawyer's son, he'd offered several times to review my important documents, claiming he wanted to make sure everything was properly organized in case of an emergency. I'd declined, but now I realized those offers weren't helpful suggestions. They were reconnaissance missions. I called Connor, needing to confirm something that was bothering me. Hey, Grandma Maggie. Twice in one day. This is a record. Connor. Honey, I need to ask you something. Have any of your aunts or uncles talked to you recently about me? About my health or whether I've been acting differently? That's weird that you ask. Yeah, actually. Aunt Emily asked me a bunch of questions last month when I was over at Mom's house. She wanted to know if you seemed confused when I visited, if you repeated yourself a lot, if you had trouble remembering things. I told her you were sharp as a tack and probably smarter than all of us combined. My heart sank. They had been building a case, gathering evidence of my supposed mental decline from my own grandson. Did anyone else ask you similar questions? Uncle Stephen did, a few weeks ago, and Aunt Gabby asked Mom if she thought you were showing signs. I didn't really understand what that meant, but Mom got upset and told her to mind her own business. Louisa had gotten upset. That was interesting. Maybe not all of my children were equally committed to this plan. Thanks for telling me, sweetheart. And Connor? Don't mention this conversation to anyone else for now, okay? Sure. But Grandma, is everything okay? You sound worried. Everything's fine. I'm just trying to understand some family dynamics. I love you. After we hung up, I realized they hadn't just been planning to steal my assets. They had been systematically building a case for my mental incompetence. The questions to Connor, the suggestions about medical checkups with unfamiliar doctors, the frequent visits to observe my behavior, it was all preparation for the day they would need to prove I was unfit to manage my own affairs. I thought about the timing of today's deception. They had chosen a moment when I would be most emotionally vulnerable, most likely to sign documents without reading them carefully. They had manipulated my love for my grandson, weaponized my worst fears, and used my trust in them against me. But the more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Why the elaborate charade? If they had already prepared legal documents and found a notary, why hadn't they simply asked me to sign them? Why the need for such theatrical deception? The answer came to me slowly, and when it did, it was like ice, water in my veins. They needed evidence that I had signed the documents while emotionally compromised. They needed witnesses who could testify that I was distraught, confused, not thinking clearly. The hospital staff who saw us arrive looking for a non-existent patient. The notary who had witnessed me signing papers while sobbing and shaking. This wasn't just about getting my signature on a new will. This was about creating a documented record of my supposed mental instability that they could use later to support their claims of my incompetence. They had turned my love for Connor into a weapon not just against my finances, but against my sanity. The full scope of their plan became clear. I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Pure, cold rage. Not the hot anger of a moment, but the calculated fury of someone who finally understands they've been played by experts. My children thought they knew me. They thought they understood the limits of my intelligence, my resources, my capability for strategic thinking. They were about to learn how catastrophically wrong they were. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was devastated, though I should have been, but because my mind was racing with strategy. By dawn, I had made a decision that would have surprised my children if they had known me as well as they thought they did. I was going to play their game better than they ever imagined possible. The first rule of warfare is to let your enemy believe they're winning while you gather intelligence and prepare your counterattack. My children had shown me their hand. Now it was time to show them mine. Or rather, to carefully conceal it while appearing to be exactly what they expected. A confused, declining old woman who would gradually become easier to manipulate. At 8 o'clock that morning, I called Stephen. "Mom?" His voice was cautious, probably expecting anger or demands for explanations. "Stephen, honey, I've been thinking about yesterday and I think I overreacted. I was just so scared about Connor. And then when I found out he was fine, I didn't know how to process everything. I'm sorry I threw you all out of the house." The relief in his voice was audible. "Mom, you don't need to apologize. We understand. It was a very emotional day for everyone. I've been looking at the papers you had me sign, and I have to admit, some of the legal language is confusing to me. Would you mind coming over this afternoon to explain everything? I want to understand what's best for the family." "Of course. I'll be there around 2. And Mom? I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. We really do have your best interests at heart." After I hung up, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Chen. Wait, I couldn't use that name. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had become a close friend over the years. She was sharp, observant, and most importantly, completely trustworthy. "Maria, I need a favor, and it's going to sound strange." "What do you need, Margaret?" "I need you to come over this afternoon and pretend to witness me being confused and forgetful. Can you do that?" There was a pause. "Margaret Sullivan, what are you up to?" I explained everything, the fake emergency, the will deception, and my suspicions about their long-term plans. Maria listened without interrupting, her anger growing with each detail. "Those ungrateful children of yours," she finally said. "Of course I'll help. What exactly do you need me to do?" When Stephen arrived that afternoon, I had transformed myself into exactly what he expected to see. I wore an old house dress instead of my usual neat attire. I had deliberately messed up my hair and applied my makeup slightly wrong, not enough to look obviously fake, but enough to suggest someone whose attention to detail was slipping. "Stephen, dear, come in. I was just making tea, but I can't remember if I already put the kettle on." I gestured vaguely toward the kitchen, where I had indeed put the kettle on but then turned it off, creating the perfect setup for appearing confused. "Let me check for you, Mom." He went to the kitchen and returned looking satisfied. "The kettle wasn't on. Why don't you sit down and I'll make the tea?" "That's so thoughtful. You know, I was just telling my neighbor, what's her name, the lady next door, about how helpful you children have been." "Mrs. Rodriguez?" "Yes, that's right. Maria. She stopped by earlier, and I was telling her about those papers you had me sign. She seemed concerned about something, but I couldn't quite follow what she was worried about." Stephen's eyes sharpened with interest. "What kind of concerns?" Right on cue, there was a knock at the door. I had asked Maria to return at exactly 2:30. "Oh, that must be Maria now. She said she wanted to check on me again." I opened the door to find Maria looking appropriately worried. "Margaret, dear, I hope you don't mind me stopping by again. I've been thinking about our conversation earlier, and I wanted to make sure you understood what you told me about those documents." Stephen stood up, immediately on alert. "I'm Stephen Sullivan, Margaret's son. You must be Mrs. Rodriguez. Yes, I'm Maria. I live next door. She looked between us with perfectly feigned concern. Margaret was telling me about some papers she signed yesterday, and she seemed a bit confused about what they were for. What did she tell you exactly? Stephen asked, his lawyer instincts taking over. Maria glanced at me with worry. She said something about hospital forms for her grandson, but then she also mentioned something about her will being changed. I tried to ask her to clarify, but she kept mixing up the details. I'm probably worrying for nothing, but when elderly people start getting confused about important legal documents. I watched Stephen's face as Maria spoke. I could see him processing this information, seeing it as confirmation of what he and his siblings had been planning. Here was an independent witness observing my supposed mental decline. Mrs. Rodriguez, I appreciate your concern for my mother, Stephen said smoothly. We've been worried about some similar issues. That's actually why we've been helping her organize her affairs, to make sure everything is properly handled if her memory continues to decline. Oh, that's wonderful that she has such caring children, Maria replied. Though I have to say, she does seem to have good days and bad days. Today she seems a bit more confused than usual. I played my part perfectly, looking between them with a slightly lost expression. Are you two talking about me? Stephen, dear, what were we discussing? Before Maria arrived, I'm having trouble following the conversation. Stephen exchanged a meaningful look with Maria, exactly the kind of look that would be very useful in court proceedings if he ever needed to testify about my mental state. After Maria left, Stephen spent another hour explaining the will to me, speaking slowly and using simple language as if I were a child. I asked confused questions, pretended to have trouble following complex concepts, and generally reinforced his belief that I was becoming mentally fragile. By the time he left, I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. His plan was working perfectly. If only he knew that mine was working even better. 3 days into my performance of being a declining old woman, I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. Mrs. Sullivan, this is Sean Mitchell, from Mitchell & Associates Legal Services. I believe you may need my help. I didn't recognize the name or the firm. I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong number. I already have an attorney. Ma'am, I'm calling because your grandson Connor reached out to us. He's very concerned about some legal documents you recently signed, and he believes you may have been taken advantage of. My heart stopped. Connor called you? Yes, ma'am. Apparently, he's been doing some research after conversations with family members raised red flags for him. He's a very bright young man, and he's worried that someone may be trying to manipulate you financially. Would you be willing to meet with me? There's no charge for the consultation. I looked around my house, suddenly paranoid that my children might have installed listening devices. Can you hold on just a moment? I walked to my front window and peered out. Stephen's car wasn't there, but that didn't mean I wasn't being watched. My children had proven they were capable of elaborate deceptions. Mr. Mitchell, I'm interested in speaking with you, but I need to be very careful about who might be watching or listening. Can we meet somewhere private? Of course. Connor suggested you might feel that way. There's a small coffee shop called The Daily Grind on Maple Street, about 15 minutes from your house. It's usually quiet in the afternoons. Would tomorrow at 3 o'clock work? The next day, I told Maria I was going shopping and asked if she could mention to anyone who asked that I had seemed a bit more confused than usual when I left. Then I drove to the coffee shop, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. Sean Mitchell was younger than I expected, probably in his early 40s, with kind eyes and a serious demeanor. He was sitting in a corner booth when I arrived, and he stood to greet me. Mrs. Sullivan, thank you for coming. Connor described you perfectly. He said you were the smartest person in his family and that anyone who underestimated you was making a big mistake. I felt tears spring to my eyes. He said that? Among other things, He's very worried about you, but not in the way your children are. He's worried that you're being manipulated and that no one is protecting your interests. Sean opened a briefcase and pulled out a legal pad covered with notes. Connor told me about the phone call you made to him when your children claimed he was in a car accident. He also told me about the questions various family members have been asking him about your mental state. When he put those pieces together with your obvious distress during that phone call, he became concerned that something serious was happening. What exactly did he tell you? He said his mother, aunts, and uncle have been asking him for months whether you seem confused, forgetful, or incapable of managing your own affairs. He said they've been pressuring him to agree that you're showing signs of dementia or mental decline. When he refused to support their concerns, because in his experience you're as sharp as ever, they became frustrated with him. This was news to me. Connor hadn't mentioned that part of the conversation. He also said that yesterday, his mother asked him directly whether he thought you were competent to make your own legal and financial decisions. When he said yes, absolutely, she became angry and told him he was being naive about your condition. Sean leaned forward. Mrs. Sullivan, Connor believes your children are building a case to have you declared mentally incompetent so they can take control of your assets. He asked me to help you understand your legal options and protect yourself. I sat back in the booth, overwhelmed. My grandson, barely 18 years old, had seen what was happening more clearly than I had initially. While I was reeling from the betrayal, he had been taking action to protect me. What can you tell me about the documents I signed? Sean's expression grew serious. I'll need to review them, but Connor described the circumstances under which you signed them. If you were emotionally compromised, if you didn't understand what you were signing, and if you were deliberately deceived about the nature of the documents, there are several grounds for challenging their validity. But they were properly notarized. That doesn't matter if you were coerced or deceived. The question is whether you had full knowledge and understanding of what you were signing, and whether you signed voluntarily. Based on what Connor told me, the answer to both questions is no. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a spark of hope. What do we do next? First, I need you to bring me copies of everything you signed. Second, we need to document your actual mental state with an independent medical evaluation. Third, we need to gather evidence of the deception your children used to obtain your signature. And fourth, I asked. Sean smiled grimly. Fourth, we make sure they understand that you're not the helpless victim they think you are. As I drove home, I realized that my grandson had just given me something invaluable. Not just legal help, but proof that not everyone in my family had turned against me. Connor saw me as I really was, not as my children wanted me to be. That night, I called Connor. Grandma Maggie, how are you feeling? Much better, thanks to you. Sean Mitchell told me about your call. I hope that was okay. I just couldn't stand by and watch them treat you like you were losing your mind when I know you're not. It was more than okay, sweetheart. It was exactly what I needed. Good. Because I have a feeling we're going to need to fight for you, and I want you to know you're not fighting alone. For the first time in days, I smiled genuinely. My children had underestimated me, but they had made an even bigger mistake. They had underestimated Connor. That would prove to be their downfall. The next morning, I called in sick to my weekly volunteer shift at the library, something I hadn't done in 15 years, and drove to a safety deposit box across town that my children knew nothing about. Inside were documents that would change everything about their carefully laid plans. 25 years ago, when Arthur was still alive and the children were young, we had made a decision that seemed overly cautious at the time. Arthur's father had lost everything during the Depression because he kept all his assets in one place, under one name. Arthur was determined that would never happen to our family. So we had created what Arthur called our insurance policy, a separate set of accounts, investments, and assets that existed entirely outside our normal financial footprint. Over the years, I had continued to contribute to these hidden accounts, especially after Arthur died. Money from small freelance bookkeeping jobs, cash gifts from relatives, even spare change that I saved religiously, it all went into accounts that were completely separate from anything my children could trace. The safety deposit box contained records of 3 different bank accounts in banks across the state, each with substantial balances. It contained the deed to a small cabin in Oregon that Arthur and I had bought as a weekend retreat, but never told the children about. Most importantly, it contained the original will that Arthur and I had made together, a will that included provisions my children would never expect. But the real treasure was a manila envelope marked, "For emergency use only," in Arthur's handwriting. Inside were documents that even I had almost forgotten about. Power of attorney forms that Arthur had insisted I prepare, giving specific people the authority to act on my behalf if I was ever incapacitated or under duress. One of those forms gave power of attorney to Connor when he reached the age of 18. Arthur had been remarkably prescient, recognizing that our grandchildren might someday be more trustworthy than our own children. I drove straight from the bank to Sean Mitchell's office with everything. "This changes the entire situation," Sean said after reviewing the documents. "Your children think they're the only beneficiaries of your estate, but according to this original will, Connor inherits the Montana ranch outright, and there are specific trusts established for all the grandchildren that your children can't touch." Arthur insisted on those provisions. He said he wanted to make sure our grandchildren would have something that couldn't be squandered by their parents. Sean studied the power of attorney documents. "This is brilliant. Connor can legally act on your behalf, which means he can challenge the fraudulent will, freeze your accounts to prevent further manipulation, and even file criminal charges if necessary." "There's more," I said, pulling out a small recording device that Arthur had given me years ago for dictating notes when my hands hurt too much to write. "I've been recording my conversations with my children since this started. I have Stephen admitting that they deliberately deceived me, Emily discussing their plans to have me declared incompetent, and Gabby talking about the financial benefits of getting control of my assets." Sean's eyes widened. "You recorded them?" "I've been recording every conversation since the fake emergency. My children think I'm too old and confused to understand technology, but Arthur taught me well. I may be 73, but I know how to use a recording app on my phone." I played him several excerpts, Stephen explaining how they had coordinated the story about Connor's accident, Emily discussing their timeline for having me evaluated by cooperative doctors who would support their incompetency claims, Gabby calculating how much money they each stood to gain once they had control of my assets. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is extraordinary evidence. They've essentially confessed to fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. But I have to ask, why didn't you confront them directly with this information?" I smiled, feeling more like myself than I had in weeks. "Because I wanted to see how far they would go. I wanted them to commit themselves completely to this plan before I revealed that they had made a crucial mistake." "What mistake?" I pulled out the copy of the fraudulent will they had tricked me into signing and pointed to a section near the end. "Look at page 12, paragraph 7. Sean read the section, then frowned. "I don't see anything unusual here." "Look at the date. The will is dated October 15th, 2024. "Yes, that's the day you signed it." "Now look at the witnesses' signatures." Sean examined the document more carefully. Then his face went pale. "The witnesses signed this document on October 10th, 5 days before you signed it. Exactly." They were so eager to have everything prepared, so confident in their plan, that they had the witnesses sign the document before they even tricked me into signing it. The will is completely invalid, not just because of the fraud, but because of basic legal requirements. Sean stared at the document in amazement. They invalidated their own fraud. Arthur used to say that the problem with people who think they're smarter than everyone else is that they eventually outsmart themselves. My children thought they were so clever, but they made the kind of basic legal error that any first-year law student would catch. This means everything they did was pointless. Even if you had signed willingly, even if there had been no deception, this will couldn't stand up in any court. I nodded. They planned this elaborate scheme for months, destroyed their relationship with their mother, committed multiple felonies. And for what? A document that's worth less than the paper it's printed on. Sean shook his head in disbelief. What do you want to do with this information? I thought about my children, about the people they had become, about the pain they had caused and the trust they had shattered. But I also thought about Connor, about the grandchildren who would suffer if their parents were arrested, about the family that could still be salvaged from this wreckage. I want to give them one chance to make this right, I said finally. One chance to confess, apologize, and try to undo the damage they've done. If they refuse that chance, then we destroy them, Sean finished. Then we destroy them, I agreed. That weekend, I told my children I was going to visit my sister in Portland, a sister who had died 3 years ago, something I was counting on them not remembering clearly. It was another test of their attention to my actual life versus their assumptions about my declining memory. That sounds nice, Mom, Emily said when I called to tell her. Do you think you should be driving that far by yourself? Maybe one of us should come with you. Oh, that's sweet, but I'll be fine. Besides, you're all so busy with your own lives. Well, if you're sure. How long will you be gone? Just a few days. Don't worry about me. The truth was, I was going to. The Oregon cabin that my children didn't know existed. I needed time and space to complete my transformation from victim to warrior, and I needed to prepare for what was coming next. The cabin sat on 5 acres of pristine forest land that Arthur and I had discovered during a weekend drive 30 years ago. We'd bought it impulsively, with cash from Arthur's small inheritance, and had spent countless weekends there over the years. After Arthur died, I had continued to visit occasionally, but I'd never mentioned it to the children because it was my private sanctuary. As I drove up the familiar gravel road, breathing in the scent of pine trees and wood smoke from neighboring cabins, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete peace. Here, there were no scheming children, no fraudulent documents, no pretense of mental decline. Here, I could be myself. I spent the first day simply existing in my own skin again. I cooked meals I actually wanted to eat, read books that challenged my mind, and worked in the small garden Arthur and I had planted decades ago. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't performing for anyone or calculating my next move. I was just Margaret Sullivan, and that felt revolutionary. On the second day, I began my real work. I called Connor from the cabin's landline, a number my other children didn't have. Grandma, how's your trip to Aunt Sarah's? Connor, I need to tell you something. Your Aunt Sarah died 3 years ago. I lied to your mother about where I was going. There was a pause. Where are you, really? Somewhere safe, where I can think clearly without worrying about being watched or overheard. And Connor, I need to ask you something important. Are you prepared to help me fight your mother and aunts and uncle? Really fight them? Because once we start this, there's no going back. Grandma, they lied about me being in a car accident to trick you into signing away your life. They've been trying to convince everyone you're losing your mind. They're stealing from you. Of course I'm prepared to fight them. It's going to get ugly. There might be criminal charges. Your parents are going to be furious with you. Let them be furious. You're my grandmother, and you've always been there for me. Now it's my turn to be there for you. I spent the next hour walking Connor through everything Sean Mitchell and I had discovered. The invalid will, the recorded confessions, the hidden assets, the power of attorney documents. By the end of the conversation, we had a complete plan. Connor, I need you to do something that's going to seem strange. I need you to start asking your mother and aunts and uncle more questions about my condition. But this time, I want you to seem worried about me, not defensive of me. What do you mean? Tell them you've been thinking about what they said, and you're starting to notice things that concern you about my behavior. Ask them what steps they think the family should take to protect me. Get them to lay out their entire plan while you're recording the conversation. You want me to pretend to agree with them? I want them to think they've finally convinced you that I'm incompetent. I want them to trust you enough to tell you everything, including things they haven't told me yet. That's brilliant. They'll think they have the whole family on their side. On the third day, I drove to a small town 2 hours away and visited a doctor Sean had recommended, someone who specialized in geriatric mental health evaluations. Dr. Patricia Wells was thorough, professional, and completely independent of any medical networks my children might have access to. After 3 hours of cognitive testing, memory assessments, and psychological evaluation, Dr. Wells delivered her verdict. Mrs. Sullivan, you have the mental acuity of someone 20 years younger. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning skills are sharp, and you show no signs whatsoever of dementia, cognitive decline, or any condition that would impact your ability to make sound decisions about your own affairs. I'll need that in writing, I said. Of course. I'll also note in my report that you appear to be under significant stress, which suggests external factors affecting your well-being rather than internal mental health issues. I drove back to the cabin that evening with Dr. Wells's official evaluation and a renewed sense of purpose. My children had spent months building a false narrative about my mental decline. Now I had professional documentation that their narrative was not just wrong, but deliberately constructed. That night, sitting on the cabin's porch and listening to the forest sounds Arthur and I had loved so much, I made my final decision about how this would end. My children had declared war on me without realizing it. Tomorrow, I would return home and begin to show them what it meant to fight someone who had spent 73 years learning how to survive, adapt, and win. They thought they knew their mother. They were about to meet Margaret Sullivan for the first time. When I returned home from my visit to my dead sister, I found my children in full panic mode. They had been calling the cabin's landline repeatedly, and when I didn't answer, they had started questioning everything I'd told them. Emily was waiting in my driveway when I pulled up. "Mom, thank God you're okay. We've been trying to reach you for 2 days." Aunt Sarah's phone went straight to voicemail every time we called. I looked at her with the perfect expression of confused innocence I'd been practicing. "Oh dear, did I give you the wrong number? I'm so sorry, sweetheart. You know how I get mixed up with phone numbers sometimes." But I could see the doubt in Emily's eyes. For the first time, one of my children was questioning whether my confusion was real or performed. Over the next few days, their carefully constructed plans began to unravel in ways they hadn't anticipated. Connor had followed my instructions perfectly, approaching each of them with seeming concern about my mental state and recording every conversation. From Louisa, he learned that they had already contacted 3 different doctors about having me evaluated, shopping for one who would be willing to declare me incompetent based on their testimony alone. From Gabby, he discovered that they had been monitoring my bank accounts and were planning to claim I was making irrational financial decisions as further evidence of mental decline. Most damaging of all, from Stephen, he learned that they had prepared guardianship, paperwork that would give them complete control over my medical care, living situation, and financial assets the moment any doctor signed an incompetency declaration. But their biggest problem was that they were starting to turn on each other. The stress of maintaining their deception was taking its toll. Stephen was angry that the others weren't being careful enough about their communications. Emily was frustrated that the medical evaluations were taking longer to arrange than expected. Louisa was having second thoughts about the entire plan, especially after Connor's pointed questions made her realize how their actions would look to the outside world. Gabby, desperate for money to pay off her mounting debts, was pushing for them to move faster and take more aggressive action. "We should just have her committed for observation," she suggested during a family meeting at Stephen's house that Connor secretly recorded. "Once she's in a facility, it's easier to keep her there." "That's kidnapping," Louisa protested. "We could go to prison." "Only if we get caught," Gabby replied. "And who's going to believe a confused old woman over 4 successful adults who are obviously concerned about her welfare?" Stephen's response was the most chilling. "Gabby's right about the timeline. The longer we wait, the more chance there is that Mom will figure out what we're doing. She's not as far gone as we thought." "What do you mean?" Emily asked. "I mean, some of her confusion seems convenient, like she's more alert when she thinks we're not watching." They were starting to suspect that I was smarter than I was pretending to be, but they were too committed to their plan to back down. Instead, they were accelerating their timeline and becoming more reckless, which was exactly what I wanted them to do. The moment I had been waiting for came exactly 2 weeks after my return from the cabin. Stephen called with barely contained excitement in his voice. "Mom, we have great news. We've arranged for you to have a complete medical evaluation with Dr. Harrison Blackwood. He's one of the most respected geriatric specialists in the state." What Stephen didn't know was that Dr. Blackwood was one of the 3 doctors Connor had learned about from his recorded conversations. The same Dr. Blackwood who, according to my children's private discussions, had been prepared to find evidence of my mental incompetence based on their testimony alone. "That sounds wonderful, dear," I said, playing my part perfectly. "When is this appointment?" "Tomorrow morning at 10. We'll all come with you to make sure the doctor gets a complete picture of our concerns." After I hung up, I called Sean Mitchell. "It's time. Tomorrow morning they're taking me to a doctor they've bribed or manipulated. They're planning to have me declared incompetent. Are you ready for this? I've never been more ready for anything in my life." That evening, I received an unexpected call from Arthur's brother, who lived in Montana near our family ranch. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I've been contacted by some lawyer claiming to represent your estate. He's asking about the ranch, wanting to know about property values and potential sales. I thought that was odd since you've never mentioned selling." My blood turned to ice. "What lawyer?" "Said his name was Margaret Sullivan. Claimed he was your son and that you'd given him power of attorney to handle your affairs. They weren't just planning to have me declared incompetent. They were already acting as if it was a done deal, making inquiries about selling property they didn't even legally control." "Margaret, is everything all right? You sound upset." "Everything's fine. But please don't discuss our family property with anyone who calls, even if they claim to be family. If there are ever any legitimate questions about the ranch, I'll contact you directly." After we hung up, I realized my children had made another crucial mistake. By contacting Arthur's brother prematurely, they had created another witness to their fraud, someone completely outside their influence who could testify about their attempts to sell property that didn't belong to them. I called Connor immediately. "Tomorrow is the day," I told him. "They're taking me to a corrupt doctor, and they've already started trying to sell the Montana ranch. Are you ready to activate our plan?" "I've been ready for weeks, Grandma. Sean has all the paperwork prepared. The recordings are saved in multiple locations. The real question is, are you ready to completely destroy your relationship with your children?" I thought about that question for a long moment. The children I had raised, the people I had loved and sacrificed for, the family I had dreamed I would always be. Those people were already gone. They had died the day my children decided to treat me as an obstacle to their inheritance rather than as their mother. "Connor," I said finally, "those people stopped being my children the day they lied about your accident. Tomorrow, they're going to meet the consequences of that choice. Then, let's give them a day they'll never forget." The war was about to begin. Dr. Harrison Blackwood's office was exactly what I expected. Sterile, intimidating, designed to make elderly patients feel small and vulnerable. My 4 children arranged themselves around me like concerned guardians as we waited, occasionally exchanging meaningful glances when they thought I wasn't looking. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Blackwood said when we were called in, "your children have expressed some concerns about your cognitive function. We're going to do some simple tests to assess your mental state." What followed was the most insulting hour of my life. Dr. Blackwood asked me questions designed for someone with severe dementia. What year it was, who the president was, simple arithmetic problems. But more telling were the leading questions, clearly designed to elicit responses my children could use against me. "Do you ever feel confused about where you are? Do you have difficulty remembering recent events? Have you been making any unusual financial decisions lately?" I played along perfectly, giving confused, hesitant answers while secretly recording everything on the device hidden in my purse. Dr. Blackwood was clearly documenting responses that would support a predetermined conclusion. After an hour of this charade, Dr. Blackwood asked my children to step outside while he completed his evaluation. The moment they left the room, his entire demeanor changed. "Mrs. Sullivan, based on my assessment, I'm going to recommend that your family pursue guardianship proceedings. You're showing clear signs of cognitive decline that make you vulnerable to financial exploitation and poor decision-making. Is that your professional medical opinion, doctor?" "Yes, it is. Your children are right to be concerned." I stood up slowly, and for the first time that day, I looked Dr. Blackwood directly in the eyes. "Doctor, I have one more question for you. How much did my children pay you to reach that conclusion?" His face went white. I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating directly that you've been bribed to declare me incompetent regardless of my actual mental state." I pulled out my recording device. "And I have documentation of this entire fraudulent evaluation." Before he could respond, the door opened and Connor walked in, followed by Sean Mitchell and 2 other men I didn't recognize. "Grandma, how did your evaluation go?" Connor asked loudly, for the benefit of my children who were still in the waiting room. "Quite educational," I replied. Dr. Blackwood was just explaining how he planned to declare me mentally incompetent despite clear evidence. To the contrary, Sean stepped forward. "Dr. Blackwood, I'm attorney Sean Mitchell, and these gentlemen are from the State Medical Board. We're here to investigate allegations of medical fraud and elder abuse." Dr. Blackwood's face went from white to green. "This is a misunderstanding." "Actually," said one of the medical board investigators, "we've been monitoring your practice for several months following other complaints. We have recordings of conversations between you and the Sullivan family discussing payment for specific medical findings." That was when my children, hearing raised voices, burst through the door. "Mom, what's going on?" Stephen demanded, then stopped cold when he saw the medical board investigators. "Stephen," I said, standing straighter than I had in weeks, "I'd like you to meet some people who are very interested in hearing about your plan to have me declared incompetent." For the first time since this nightmare began, I was no longer pretending to be confused, and my children finally realized they had made a catastrophic mistake. What happened next wasn't the dramatic confrontation I had expected. It was something far more devastating. The complete collapse of my children's carefully constructed lies. Within minutes, the medical board investigators had Dr. Blackwood in handcuffs for medical fraud and accepting bribes. Stephen, as the lawyer, who had orchestrated the scheme, was facing criminal charges for elder abuse and conspiracy. Emily's financial planning license was suspended pending investigation. Louisa and Gabby stood in the corner of the office, crying and staring at their phones as if somehow the internet could explain how their lives had just imploded. But the moment that truly ended everything came when Sean pulled out the copies of the fraudulent will they had tricked me into signing. "Before we discuss criminal charges," he announced to the room, I think everyone should know that the document at the center of this conspiracy is completely invalid. Stephen looked up sharply. What do you mean, invalid? I mean your witnesses? Signed the will 5 days before your mother did. Basic legal requirement. Witnesses must observe the testator's signature. Since they obviously didn't, the entire document is worthless. The silence that followed was absolute. My children had committed multiple felonies, destroyed their relationships with their mother and their nephew, ruined their professional reputations, and faced potential prison time. All for a document that could never have been legally enforced anyway. You mean, Emily whispered, everything we did was for nothing? Worse than nothing, Sean replied. You've committed serious crimes in pursuit of something that was impossible to achieve. That's when Louisa finally broke completely. I told you this was wrong, she sobbed to her siblings. I told you we should just talk to Mom directly, but you wouldn't listen. You said she was too senile to understand, but she understood everything. She was always smarter than all of us. As my children faced the reality of criminal charges, destroyed careers, and broken families, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but sadness. These weren't the children I had raised. Somewhere along the way, greed and entitlement had transformed my babies into strangers. The unexpected resolution came 3 months later. In exchange for full restitution of all funds they had spent, public apologies, and mandatory counseling, I agreed not to press criminal charges. Dr. Blackwood wasn't so lucky. He lost his license and served 18 months in prison. My children and I see each other now at holidays, stiff and formal. Our relationship forever changed. But Connor visits every week, and last month he brought his girlfriend Emily to meet me. They're planning to get married next year, and they've asked me to help them buy their first house. I'm thinking of giving them the Oregon cabin as a wedding gift. After all, some secrets are worth keeping, and some family members are worth trusting. The will they fought so hard to steal? I tore it up and wrote a new one. Connor inherits everything. It turns out blood isn't always thicker than water, but love and loyalty always are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.